Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
What we're going to do, because we have a shorter amount of time, and also it's Rosh Chodesh, so we're not saying Tachnun. So I thought we should take a break from studying Tachnun, is we'll just have a little one-off. We're going to do a lot of text today, so I apologize in advance to the people who are going to listen to this later on without seeing the screen, but I'll do my best to describe what we're looking at. So I thought today we would talk about the peculiar Rosh Chodesh Torah reading, peculiar because it's the only one I can think of in the standard Torah reading cycle where we actually go back a verse and reread a verse that we already read. So we're going to read the Talmud passage that talks about why we do that. Okay, that's what we're going to do today. So just to set the stage for you, the Talmud has a number of rules about Torah reading that are all written in passages around what we're going to read today, but we don't have time to skip around and read all of these things. So I'm just going to tell you what the rules are. So the rules are, first of all, that an aliyah needs to be at least 3 verses. One. Number 2, you're not allowed to, we'll look at the text of the Torah in a minute, but you're probably familiar with the way a Sefer Torah is written. In the parchment scroll, there are some blank spaces. They sort of mark what we in English would call paragraphs, loosely speaking. They're called parshiot dividers. Those paragraphs are called parshiot. And there's also a rule that you can't leave you can't start fewer than 3 verses from the beginning of a parshiah or parashah, nor can you leave under 3 verses. Okay, so in other words, you can't just, if a parsha is 5 psukim, you can't read one aliyah to be 3 psukim and then stop at the end of aliyah and leave over 2. So you're never allowed to start 1 or 2 verses into a parsha. It has to be at least 3. You're never allowed to end with only 1 or 2 verses in a parsha. It's got to be at least 3, and every aliyah has to be 3. So those are rules that it says in the Talmud around our passage. We're not going to read those rules, but just trust me, it says those things in the Talmud. Okay? And now we're going to have a brief look at our Torah reading for today. Here's how it looks in the Torah. Okay? Here's how it looks in the Torah. So this is 8. This first section is 8 verses. Everyone sees my cursor, right? Yes. Someone nod. If someone say yes, I see your cursor. Okay, good. So this first section is 8 verses. Then we have 2 verses, and then we have 5 verses. Okay. How do we know that this is supposed to be the Torah reading for Rosh Hodesh? Because the Mishnah says so. And the Mishnah also says, the Mishnah tells us how many aliyot we have every day. Monday, Thursday, and Mincha we have 3. Shabbat morning we have 7. Holidays we have 5. Yom Kippur we have 6. And on Rosh Chodesh we have 4. Okay? That's just the rule that the Mishnah says. So we need to have 4 aliyot. And here is our reading. We have 8 verses, 2 verses, and 5 verses. So right away you can see the problem. Okay? 5 verses, this could be 1 aliyah. That's not a problem. Okay? But then we have 2 verses. What are we going to do with those 2 verses? An aliyah can't be 2 verses, right? It has to be at least 3 verses. So if I said, okay, my first paragraph, parashah, which has 8 psukim, I'm going to read 3 psukim for the first aliyah, 3 psukim for the second aliyah. That's 3 plus 3, which is 6. 8 minus 6 is 2. So that means with 2 psukim, I can't stop 2 psukim before the end. I could keep going and finish the paragraph, but then I'm not going to have enough verses left for another aliyah to make it 4 aliyot. That's the problem. So that is the problem that our Talmud faces. So this problem is discussed in Tractate Megillah, which is about Purim and Megillah reading. And why is it there? Because Tractate Megillah talks, among other things, about the reading of Megillat Esther, the Purim scroll, and the thematic hook there is then there's a discussion about Torah, other scrolls, Torah scrolls, how we read Torah, who reads from the Torah, how many aliyot we read on what occasion. There's no tractate in the Talmud that just talks about Torah reading, because there's nothing in the Mishnah. There's no tractate in the Mishnah that talks about that. So the hook, where it's sort of stuck, sometimes there are, I'm going to call them in air quotes, smaller subjects or subjects that don't really have a Mishnah tractate, that they get kind of stuck in another tractate. So for example, in the Daf Yomi cycle, or the daily reading of Talmud right now, we're reading tractate Moed Katan, which is about the laws of Chol HaMoed. On Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of Pesach and Sukkot, some malacha, some labor is forbidden, and some is permitted under certain circumstances. The other time in the Jewish calendar when some labor is forbidden and some is permitted is also when someone is in mourning. And so the laws of Avelut or mourning are stuck in the tractate Moed Katan, which is mostly about Chol HaMoed. There's no separate tractate on the laws of mourning. So sometimes when there isn't a separate tractate on a whole subject, that subject will get stuck in next to something that it is sort of like, all right? And so tractate Megillah, since the central mitzvah of Purim is the reading of the Megillah, which is a scroll, then we have several pages about scrolls and buying and selling Torah scrolls and how Torah scrolls are written and how Torah scrolls are read, including all stuff about aliyot and different readings on different holidays. That's why they're stuck in Tractate Megillah. Okay? So, if you want to play at home, you can go to safaria.org and click on Talmud, and then go to Tractate Megillah in the Talmud, page 21b. Okay. First, the Talmud quotes the line in the Mishnah that it's going to talk about. We learned in the Mishnah on Rosh Chodesh and Chol HaMoed, we call up 4 aliyot. That's just the law in the Mishnah. Okay? So now the question is, how do we get 4? Ba'amine Ulam barav me Rava. Ula, son of Rav, asked Rava, presumably his teacher, how do we read the Rosh Chodesh portion? Tzavet B'nai Yisrael, which is what we read today, which is that first paragraph is 8 psukim. How do we do it? If you say that the first 2 readers, the first 2 aliyot, each read 3 verses, then there's 8 minus 3 equals 2. Then there are 2 verses at the end of the paragraph, and we know the rule that you cannot leave fewer than 3 verses at the end of a paragraph. If you say that, okay, so let's divide that paragraph up 4 and 4, we finish the 8, but then we have the next paragraph, which is only 2 verses, and we can't read an aliyah that's 2 verses. Okay, how about if we read those 2 verses and then 1 verse of the next paragraph, or 2 verses of the next paragraph, because the next paragraph has 5. We learned that we're not allowed to read only 1 or 2 verses of a paragraph. Okay? So we're stuck with this problem of 8, 2, and 5. Does anyone have a question about the problem? If you do, I can't see hands, so just shout it out. Okay. So 8, 2, and 5. The question is, how can 8, 2, and 5, of course, 8 plus 2 plus 5 is 15. 4 aliyot, 3 people each is 12, but we have all these rules about where you can and cannot stop. Okay? You can't stop within 3 psukim from the end, meaning 2 or 1 psukim from the end. You can't end an aliyah 1 or 2 psukim into a new paragraph, and you can't read an aliyah of only 2 lines. So we're kind of stuck. Rava, presumably his teacher, said to him, I love this, by the way, Zo lo shamati. I never learned that halacha. I don't know. Kayotse ba shamati. However, I have learned a discussion about an analogous situation. Okay, I have to explain a little bit of background about this analogous situation, and that is about the ma'amadot, or in English they are translated as courses, courses, but we would translate them as groupings. The Mishnah says that in Second Temple times, all of the Kohanim were broken up into 24 units or groups, or the English is usually translated as courses. I don't know why they translate it that way. 24 courses. Each group, and they each had a name, and and many of them were families. They were genetically related, genealogically related. And each group of Kohanim would go up to the temple in Jerusalem 1 week, and they would do the sacrifices there, and then they would go home. And they would do that twice a year. So if we have 24 courses, and each one goes for a week, that's 24 weeks, and they do it twice a year, that's 48 weeks, which is pretty close to a lunar year, the Jewish year. And then there are all kinds of little odds and ends, which I'm not going to get into. Attached to each group of Kohanim, there were also Leviim. They would come up and be the Leviim in the temple, the helpers. And attached to each group of the 24 groups of Kohanim would be Yisraelim, plain old civilian Israelites like you and me, who are not Kohanim and Leviim. Those people, if they lived close to Jerusalem or in Jerusalem, they might go to the temple. They wouldn't go do sacrifices, but they would do prayers, in the public area outside the temple where the non-Kohanim and non-Leviim were allowed. If they lived far, because most of them probably lived far, and they were, farmers and merchants, they couldn't go to Jerusalem for a week twice a year. What they would do is they would gather together for presumably prayers, although we don't know exactly what they prayed, in their villages. In other words, there was a system where all of Bnei Israel in the land of Israel during Second Temple times, not First Temple times, Second Temple times, according to the Mishnah, were broken up into 24 groups, and twice a year for 1 week, each group was, I will put it in air quotes, responsible for participating in the temple service. The Kohanim who were able to go went and actually did the sacrifices. Leviim who were able to go actually went and helped them. Yisraelim gathered in their towns and villages, and we would pray and read Torah as an act of, let's just call it participation with our ma'amad, or course. So actually, technically, the groups of Kohanim are called mishmarot, and the rest of the people who are the support team are called ma'amadot. All right? So all the Israelites were part of a ma'amad, all right? And we supported our mishmar of Kohanim for 1 week, twice a year. This was a system that the Mishnah says was functional in the Second Temple period. How functional was it? How widespread was it historically? We don't know the answer to that, but that's what the Mishnah says. Now, every day of the weekdays, we Yisraelim in our villages who gathered and said certain prayers would read Torah every day of that week, of our week, the day of our ma'amad. What was the laning? The laning was the first chapter of Breshit. Okay? Like we read it on Simchas Torah. On Sunday, they would read day 1 and day 2 of Breshit. On Monday, they would read day 2 and day 3. On Tuesday, they would read day 3 and day 4, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? Parenthetical comment about this. It's parenthetical. It's not in the Gemara. Why did they read Breshit? Why was that the reading that was selected? So I heard a really interesting shiur on this once from Eben Leader, who's a scholar at Hebrew College in Boston, the rabbinical school there. And he said, this is a total digression, by the way. We're going to get back to the Torah reading in a minute, so I'm going to keep it short. Ancient Israelite religion, he said, like all indigenous religions, meaning religions connected to their land where they feel rooted, all indigenous religions basically believe their place of worship is the center of the universe, And the entire universe depends on their worship. Our worship sustains the universe and is a crucial part of the running of the universe. Otherwise, the universe would collapse. Okay? And we have lots of passages in rabbinic sources that say that sacrifice sustains the world in ancient times. The temple in Jerusalem is the center of the world. The foundation stone under the Mizbeach, or under the Kodesh HaKodashim, under the Mizbeach, under the Kodesh HaKodashim, I can't remember, is the omphalos, the navel of the universe. Okay? And so it would not be surprising, says Eben Leder, that the laning that was read in the villages on our week was the reading about the forming of the universe. So we, in reading about the creation of the universe all week long, 6 days until Shabbat, are participating with our Kohanim and Leviim who are going in to Jerusalem, who are doing the sacrificial service, which helps maintain the universe, in air quotes, the universe as we know it. What's the core idea of the universe as we know it? It's the second paragraph of the Shema, right? If you worship God correctly, there will be rain, there will be crops, we will eat, we will survive. If we do not worship God correctly, there will be no rain, there will be no crops, we will starve, we will not survive. Now, you might say that that is a rather myopic view of the universe. And as they say in law, I think, so stipulated. Okay, but that was the ancient Israelite view of the universe. The universe is about the system of rain and crops, and what we do in our worship sustains the proper running of the universe or not. That is the theory, Rabbi Eben Leder's theory, about why we read Ma'aseh Breshit, chapter 1 of Genesis, during that week. Now I'm ending the parenthetical comment. Okay? And I don't want to, that would be an interesting discussion to have, but we're not going to discuss it, because if we could discuss it, we're never going to get to the text. So Rava says, I don't know anything about the rule of Rosh Hodesh. I never learned that. However, he says, I did learn something else analogous. We learn in the Mishnah, which talks about what are the readings during the Ma'amadot. We learn in the Mishnah. On day 1, we read Breshit and Vihi Rakia, means day 1 and day 2 of Genesis. On day 2, we read 2 and 3, etc., etc. V'tanei Allah. And when we discussed that Mishnah, we talked about how we divide up the aliyahs. Breshit, paragraph 1, is divided into 2 aliyahs. And Yehi Rakia, day 2, is a third aliyah. Okay? So day 1 is broken up into 2 aliyahs, and day 2 is the third aliyah. Okay? But there's a problem with that, and we discussed it. This is discussed elsewhere in the Talmud. Rava is saying, I learned it, but this discussion takes place elsewhere in the Talmud. Okay, we said in the Talmud, day 2, Yehi Rakia, let there be a firmament, was read by one reader because that consists of 3 verses. But Breshit, the first paragraph, consists of 5 verses. How are we going to divide it into 2 aliyot? Because we learned in our Mishnah, right, the one who reads the Torah can only read a minimum of 3 verses. How do you divide 5 into 2 if the minimum has to be 3? Everyone with me on the question? And everyone understand how it's sort of analogous to ours. Well, you'll see in a moment how it's analogous. The Itamar Allah, in that discussion elsewhere in the Talmud about the Breshit reading, there was a machloket, or a disagreement. There were 2 solutions, Rav and Shmuel, first generation Amoraim in Babylonia. I don't know, 230-ish, something like that, of the Common Era. Rav said the solution for dividing a paragraph of 5 verses into 2 is doleg, which literally means to skip. But skip means you skip back 1 verse. And that is translated in our English as repeat. Our English repeat here, where my cursor is a translation of the word doleg. Those of you who know Hebrew will say doleg does not mean repeat. It really means skip. And that's correct. and it really means you skip backwards a verse. That's why the English translated as repeat. Shmuel says, posek, you stop in the middle of a verse. Okay, I will pause now very briefly. The way we do Rosh Chodesh is according to who? Rav or Shmuel? You can shout it out.
Rav.
Rav. Pretty straightforward. You might also say, stop in the middle of a verse? How could you do that? Which is what the Talmud is going to say in a moment. So we have a machloket, Rav and Shmuel. And the halacha is usually according to Rav, except when it isn't. And this is one of the cases when it is. Rav Amar, now the Talmud does something that it frequently does when there's a machloket. It'll say these two opinions. How come person number one doesn't give the answer of person number two? How come person number two doesn't give the answer of person number one? Rav says you skip back a verse. Why doesn't he say, like Shmuel, just stop in the middle of a verse? Answer, would kind of probably your intuitive answer. If we're Moshe Rabbeinu, who wrote down the Torah, he doesn't have a verse ending there. We're going to make a verse ending. We're going to take a pasuk, stop it in the middle, and say that's where the aliyah ends. So we're going to take 5 psukim, and we're going to have one aliyah be 2.5 psukim, but we're going to call it 3. And we're going to have the other aliyah be 2.5 psukim, but we're going to call it 3. What are you talking about? All of that is contained in any verse that Moses did not divide, we may not divide. That's why Rav says you got to skip back a line. Shmuel says you can divide it, but into 2. Isn't there a story that Rabbi Hanania Kara, the Bible expert, said, I had an argument with Rabbi Hanina the Great. He gave me a hard time because he was a teacher. The first one, Rabbi Hanania Kara, was a teacher, apparently. And there are many times when I was teaching school children and I asked my teacher's permission, could I divide a verse? And he said, I may do so only when you're teaching school children. School children, they can't learn a whole pasuk if it's a long one. So you're allowed to break the psukim into half. Okay? But in other cases, you can't break a pasuk into half. Okay? So why was he allowed to do it? Only for school children, because there was no alternative, because school children are not capable of learning a whole verse. Okay? If it's a long verse. You got to break it down for them. Okay? So we'd say here too, Shmuel would say, okay, here too, I got to break it in half because I got to get enough aliyot. So that's why I'm breaking it in half. Okay. Shmuel, who says you break it in half, why doesn't he say, like Rav, you skip back? It is a gzeira or a decree because of people who coming and going. What does this mean? This means if you are in shul for the first 3 verses, okay, and you do it according to Rav, we read 3 verses, we stop, and we leave 2 verses unread, which is exactly the way we do it today. And then you leave shul because you got to go to the bathroom. What are you going to think? You're going to think, oh, that's interesting. The next aliyah, they read 2 verses. I guess that's permitted. That's what you're going to think, because you're not actually going to be present for that aliyah, right? And therefore, because it might create a misconception, because there are people who come and go in shul, we want everyone to know that an aliyah has to be at least 3 psukim. That's why we skip back. That's why, so Shmuel thinks you shouldn't skip back. That's why he says it's better to divide. Okay? The person who leaves after the first 3 psukim isn't going to know or realize that the Torah reader is going to repeat the last pasuk, right? And make an aliyah of 3. There will be a misconception cast about what the halacha is. Therefore, it's better to break an aliyah into 2. Okay? So, and then there's further discussion. So I want to summarize, okay? So the question is, how are we going to read the Rosh Chodesh Torah reading, which has 4 aliyot and has this layout in the Sefer Torah, given the rules of number of verses? Ula asked that question of Rava. Rava said, I don't know the answer to that. By the way, it's a great, thoughtful rabbinic answer. I don't know the answer to that one. But, there's an analogous situation in the Ma'amadot on Sunday, we learn in the Mishnah that you're supposed to read day 1 and day 2 of Breshit. Day 1 is 5 and day 2 is 3. And we had a discussion there in the Talmud about that, right? I do know that because we had a discussion about it. We had a discussion. We said, how do we do it? And we said that there's a machloket or disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says you skip back a verse, meaning, to make that specific, in Breshit on Sunday, the first aliyah is verse 1, 2, and 3. And the second aliyah is verse 3, 4, and 5, just to make it crystal clear. You skip back and you repeat verse 3. So that's how you have 2 aliyot. There's a machloket between Rav and Shmuel. We also had about why each one doesn't hold the other. And I skipped it. Later on, it says, halacha kerav, the law is according to Rav, that we skip back rather than dividing. So Rava, by the way, who is 3rd generation of Babylonian Amoraim, let's say he's roughly, 70 years after Rav and Shmuel-ish, okay, 300-ish, early 300s. Rava was asked a question about the Mishnah from 100 and some odd years before. By the way, that raises the question, from the Mishnah's time until Rava's time, which is about 100 years, what did they actually read on Rosh Chodesh? How did they read? I don't know the answer to that, okay? So Ula asked Rava, so what are we supposed to read on Rosh Chodesh? Rava says, I don't know the law about that. I never learned it. There's an analogous situation, and that's the Sunday of the Ma'amadot, and we do have a Talmudic discussion about that. And in that Talmudic discussion, there's a machloket or disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. Rav says you skip back a verse. Shmuel says you divide the 3rd verse right in the middle, okay? And we had a discussion about why each one doesn't go like the other one. In the end, we decided like Rav. So by an analogy, for Rosh Chodesh, we should do it the same way, like Rav, which is to skip back a verse rather than to divide a verse into 2, which is what Shmuel would have us do. Shmuel would have us divide it into 2 because you might hear the first 3 psukim, you might leave shul and think that the next aliyah is only going to be 2 psukim, and then you would be misled about what the halacha is, okay? But in the end, the halacha is not according to Shmuel, it is according to Rav, and that is why we skip back on Rosh Chodesh, and that is why we have this peculiar Torah reading. And if you were ever wondering why, the answer is because of the discussion in Tractate Megillah 21b and 22a. That's why we do it. I will pause briefly for questions or comments or thoughts. Just unmute, wave your hand.
Avi?
Yeah.
It's completely coincidental because you had started your talk and Marshall wasn't listening. Marshall Lane today. And Marshall came over to me and while you were beginning and said, I want to show you something. So he handed me the sheets that he uses to practice laning Torah.
Yeah.
And he says, you know why I stopped before the second aliyah today? Because I don't know if you were there, but he actually paused for quite a while.
Yeah.
He says, because I saw this note in the sheet that said that this verse is repeated. And he said, and this is Marshall who has laying this Rosh Chodesh many times. He said, I never knew that because in the Siddur, it simply repeats the verse.
Right. Meaning in the Siddur, it makes it look, the Siddur, which is done for our convenience as readers, it makes it look like the verse is kind of written twice. But in the Torah, the verse is not written twice. It's written once. And the laner needs to know to go back and repeat it. And this is sort of anyone who's a rookie laner who learns Rosh Chodesh Torah reading, we always train them in that. And they're always a little, the reason they're confused, we don't do ma'amadot anymore. So I can't think of any other situation where we go back and read a pasuk again. By the way, in theory, there could be a situation, sometimes laners make a mistake in where they end an aliyah, and the person jumps in with the bracha, and then what do? You have to have a nimble gabbai who knows the rules and knows what to do. So in theory, there could be other situations that could arise spontaneously, situationally, where the gabbai would say, just go back and repeat that verse. Or it happens sometimes when the laner goes too far and they read one verse too much or something like that. If there's enough verses left, then the next laner should really start from where they stopped. If there aren't, they have to kind of go back a verse. So there are times when ad hoc you would do it. I'm not sure there are any other times where ab initio in our laning cycle, that's when you do it. So that's when we do it on Rosh Chodesh, and now you know why. Other questions, comments? Verit says a good Chodesh to all. I'll say a good Chodesh to all, but I'll give you a minute or two. I don't know. It's not really a class that invites lots of questions or comments, but it's just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. It's a discussion in the Talmud. Rava doesn't know the answer. He reasons by analogy from another discussion in the Talmud, which is an analogous situation, which is interesting because it's analogous, but it's lost to us because we don't do ma'amadot anymore, right? We don't gather together and do those Breshit readings. We don't have that system anymore. But it was known to, by the way, did they practice it in Rava's time? I have no idea. And Rava lived in Babylonia anyway, so it wouldn't pertain to him. Rava doesn't say, this is what I've seen them do. Rava says, I know another passage from elsewhere in the Talmud about an analogous situation in terms of number of verses where there's an argument about it, and this is the solution. So by inference, this is the solution that must apply, and that is how we read our laning on Rosh Chodesh, and that is what we did this morning, and we'll do again, God willing, tomorrow morning on the first day of Adar Aleph.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.